Okay, so today we're doing a deep dive into the work of economist Paul Collier.
Yeah, specifically his book, The Future of Capitalism, Facing the New Anxieties. It's certainly generated a lot of discussion.
Absolutely. And we've got a good mix of source material to work with, bits from articles, reviews, and even an interview with Collier himself.
Right, so we get his ideas, but also how others are seeing them.
Exactly. So the plan is to kind of unpack all of this for you. We want to really get a handle on Collier's diagnosis, what he thinks is wrong with capitalism today, these new anxieties he talks about.
And then, crucially, look at the solutions he's proposing.
Yeah.
What does he think we should do about it?
Right. Think of this as, your guide to getting up to speed on Collier's arguments pretty quickly.
Okay, so where does he start? Well, Collier's basic premise is that capitalism, it's the only system we know that creates mass prosperity.
Yeah, he acknowledges that up front.
But he says it has this history of, well, derailing, going off track.
Yeah.
He points to the early 19th century, the 1930s.
Bad times, grim conditions, mass unemployment.
Exactly. And his argument is we're in another one of those moments now, a derailment that's been sort of building up since the 80s.
And this current derailment, he links it to a business culture that's lost its ethical way, leading to these new mass anxieties.
That's the core idea, a business culture shorn of ethics. And a key takeaway is his point that you can't just leave capitalism on autopilot. It needs managing. It needs active policy.
Like it needed public investment or Keynesian ideas back then. It needs something now.
Right. And he sees two huge splits driving these anxieties, tearing societies apart.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the spatial divide. This is the gap, the growing gap between booming cities, the metropolises, and what he calls broken provincial cities.
And he uses his own story here, doesn't he?
He does, very powerfully. Growing up in Sheffield, which he labels an emblematic broken provincial city, he talks about how its main industry, steel, just collapsed.
Yeah, he says it imploded in just 5 years due to inept public policy. It's pretty stark.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then he contrasts that with his life now in Oxford. Successful, desirable metropolitan area. He even mentions his postcode.
High house prices relative to income, right?
Yeah.
Highlighting that geographical luck almost.
Exactly. It makes that abstract idea of a spatial divide very, very real.
Okay, so that's the first divide. What's the second?
The second is the class divide, the gulf between the college-educated and the less educated.
And again, his own background comes into play. Highly educated himself, Oxford, Harvard, Paris.
While his parents left school at 12. That contrast is there again.
But there's another story, too, about his cousin.
Yeah, and this one's really poignant. His cousin, born the same day, same background in Sheffield. Collier talks about how their lives went in such different directions. His cousin faced, well, significant trauma, teenage motherhood across generations, things he feels were avoidable.
Wow. So he's really saying these divides aren't just statistics. They're lived experiences with profound consequences.
Precisely. His overall take is that for the skilled metropolitans, global capitalism has been great. They've never had it so good.
But for the less educated provincials,
It's a different story. Burning injustices, skills losing value, loss of social standing, family structures weakening.
and this group, feeling left behind, they're the ones turning to populism.
Yeah, that's his argument. He calls them the mutineers, the people drawn to Brexit, Trump, Corbyn, Five Star in Italy, AFD in Germany. These movements feeding off that sense of grievance.
But he doesn't just blame populists or global forces. He points fingers at mainstream politics, too.
Oh, absolutely. He argues that the conventional parties, both left and right, kind of lost their way after the 1980s. They abandoned what he calls their pragmatic ethical foundations.
Got lured into fashionable cul-de-sacs, I think is his phrase.
Yes, that's the one. So let's take the right first.
Okay, what was their misstep, according to Collier?
He says they ditched the one nation tradition. The idea of socially responsible conservatism, maybe embodied by firms like Cadbury or John Lewis back in the day, firms with a purpose beyond profit.
And instead they embraced.
What he calls Friedman's worship of the market. Milton Friedman's idea.
Right, the whole business of business is business idea. Profit above all.
Yeah, and Collier sees that as a travesty of Adam Smith. He thinks it promotes this ferocious self-interest and ignores Smith's other work on morality.
And influenced by libertarian ideas, especially in the U.S.
Yeah, this led to policies where basically ethics became secondary, deregulation, fierce competition, short-term targets like quarterly profits that became the focus, the firm's job, profit, individual fulfillment, personal achievement.
Okay, so that's the Right.
hmm
And the left. Did they make a parallel mistake?
In his view, yes, just a different kind. He says the left abandoned its roots in things like the cooperative movement.
Which was about mutual support, right?
Yeah,
Reciprocal obligations, helping ordinary people with practical stuff like housing or shops.
exactly. Community-based, practical solutions. Instead, he argues, the left got captured by two other ways of thinking.
Which were?
Well, first, what he terms utilitarian paternalists.
Mm.
Often economists, thinking the state, guided by experts, knows best how to redistribute wealth for maximum overall happiness. But, he argues, they ignored things like dignity, people feeling they've earned their place.
Just focusing on the numbers, maybe?
Kind of. And the second group, he calls them Rawlsian libertarian lawyers,
Okay, what's their focus?
conferring specific human rights onto certain favored groups, often based on abstract philosophical principles, but potentially overlooking the wider public interest or practical consequences.
So Collier's saying the net effect was responsibilities got pushed onto the state.
While rights were handed out selectively, without necessarily demanding anything in return. And his big point is, both of these shifts, left and right, were driven by the educated metropolitan crowd.
And they just didn't connect with the less educated provincial folks, didn't address their anxieties.
Exactly, so those divisions just got wider and deeper.
Which brings us back to Adam Smith, but not the one everyone quotes.
Right, not just the wealth of nations and the invisible hand. Collier says we really need to look at Smith's other major book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Where Smith talks about sympathy, morality, how we judge ourselves and others.
Yes, Collier wants to bring back this idea of social man, the idea that we're fundamentally creatures of reciprocity. We care about dignity, about mutual obligation, not just the purely self-interested economic man that dominates a lot of standard economic models.
Okay, so he thinks modern capitalism, influenced by those utilitarian, Rawlsian, libertarian trends.
Has lost those values, lost that sense of reciprocity and dignity. And the result, he has this really strong phrase for it, the Rottweiler society.
Aggressive, focused on humiliating others, driven by fear.
Yeah, where it feels like everyone's pitted against each other, not a pretty picture.
So what's the alternative? How do we fix it?
His answer is about restoring ethics.
Yeah.
But he's specific. It's about the ethics of reciprocal obligation in families, in companies, in the state itself.
Not what he calls the fashionable ethics of victims and outrage.
Right. He thinks those can be divisive. He emphasizes that firms and families aren't just, vehicles for profit or raising kids. They're the ethical heart of society.
And these reciprocal obligations, they work because rights come with responsibilities.
That's the idea. If people feel their needs are met and that obligations are mutual, they're more likely to accept them. It's about fairness, essentially.
And his approach to solutions is described as pragmatic, aiming for the hard center.
Yeah, he's trying to steer clear of rigid ideologies or easy populist answers. He offers some quite concrete, though challenging, proposals.
Like tackling that spatial divide between the successful cities and the struggling towns.
Yes. His big idea there is to tax what he calls agglomeration rents.
Okay, what are those exactly?
It's basically the extra money people earn simply because they work in a successful city, surrounded by other skilled people. It's a premium earned from being in that cluster.
And he wants to tax that premium.
And use the revenue to invest in and revitalize those broken provincial cities.
He has that line, London is Britain's new oil.
It's a very striking metaphor, yeah.
Yeah.
Captures the idea of a resource that could be used for the benefit of the whole country.
But the reviews point out that's easier said than done, right?
Oh, definitely. The sources acknowledge it's not an easy task. Politically, practically, it would be very challenging to implement.
Okay, what about the class divide? The educated versus less educated gap.
There he talks about social maternalism, which sounds a bit odd maybe, but he contrasts this with paternalism.
So it's not the state telling people what to do from above?
No, it's more about intensive practical help, mentoring, support, working closely with people and with NGOs. Less about just monitoring and ticking boxes.
And curbing predatory behaviors of highly skilled.
Yeah, he floats ideas like perhaps heavier taxes on certain sectors, like, say, parts of finance or asset management, to encourage talented people to move into areas that create more tangible social value, like innovation or building businesses in those struggling regions.
Again, sounds difficult to actually pull off.
The sources agree, yeah. It's noted as being difficult.
A really big part of his plan seems to be rethinking education and skills.
Huge. He calls for a massive shift of focus away from just academic cognitive skills towards vocational practical skills.
Right.
To boost the productivity and, crucially, the dignity of people without university degrees, especially in those provincial areas. Give them valuable skills that are in demand.
Does he have examples of this working?
He points to Switzerland. Their system of apprenticeships, 4 years long. Companies co-fund them. Graduates are highly employable.
And he contrasts that with somewhere like the UK.
Sharply. He talks about the collapse of apprenticeships in the UK and the reliance on bringing in skilled workers from abroad. He uses the example of the UK needing doctors trained in, say, Ghana.
Which he calls an ethical disgrace. Strong words.
Very strong. It highlights the interconnectedness of these issues, domestic skills policy and global ethics.
And what about the role of companies themselves, the ethical firm?
Yeah, he keeps coming back to this. Firms need to see themselves as responsible to more than just shareholders. They have obligations to their workers, their customers, the communities they operate in.
The sources mention John Lewis and Toyota as positive examples.
Yes, companies known for a more ethical approach, strong relationships with employees, and long-term success. Contrasted with firms like BHS or General Motors, which, faced bankruptcy and had more troubled reputations.
The Toyota Andon Cord example really stood out.
That's a great one, isn't it? Any worker can stop the entire production line if they see a problem. It shows incredible trust and mutual obligation between management and workforce. That's the kind of ethical culture he's advocating for.
He also touches on the global picture briefly, international bodies.
Yeah, extending the idea of reciprocal obligations to the international level. And he includes a sort of mea culpa, an admission that policies like trade liberalization, which he previously supported, had unforeseen negative impacts on poorer nations and weakened global cooperation.
Okay, so that's a lot of diagnosis and proposed remedies. But what about the critiques? The sources mention some pushback.
They do. A common point in the reviews is that while his analysis of the problem, the why and what, is really insightful.
The how to solve it part can feel a bit less detailed.
Exactly. More like setting a direction than providing a complete roadmap, which is maybe understandable given the complexity.
And there was a point about him maybe oversimplifying things like utilitarianism or Rawls, setting up straw men.
Yes, one review suggested that, arguing that those philosophical traditions are maybe more nuanced than his critique allows for.
And that modern economics isn't quite the caricature he sometimes paints.
Right, pointing out that fields like behavioral economics do engage with ideas beyond pure self-interest, looking at psychology, fairness, and so on. The discipline is perhaps more diverse than his critique implies.
And obviously, not everyone buys his arguments wholesale. You mentioned a comment calling him a nut.
Yeah, well, strong ideas provoke strong reactions. It just shows there are definitely different perspectives out there.
Collier also talks about leadership, doesn't he? How does that fit in?
It connects directly to his ideas about dignity and mutual respect. He contrasts good and bad leadership.
Bad leaders are
those who think they deserve their position, who look down on others as greedy, lazy, selfish. This leads, he says, to a culture of mistrust, of tick boxes, which actually undermines people's judgment and ability to act responsibly.
Whereas good leaders
are humble. They set goals, but they empower their teams. They trust people, give them agency, and create an environment where everyone learns together.
He links this to psychology, James's will to believe.
Yeah, the idea that how we treat people profoundly affects what they become. If you treat people with suspicion, they might live down to that. If you treat them as capable and responsible,
they might rise to the occasion.
Exactly. He thinks society and leaders play a huge role in either dragging people down or lifting them up.
And he uses COVID responses as an example.
He does. Contrasting Denmark, where he argues the leadership appealed to citizens' sense of responsibility as neighbors, resulting in better outcomes.
With the U.S., where he saw scenes like queues for gun shops as showing a kind of rampant individualism that damaged the collective response.
Right, which links back to another major theme, the importance of shared identity. Belonging.
He feels the educated elite has kind of detached itself.
Yeah, he uses the phrase peeled off, that the metropolitan educated group has sort of lost its sense of shared identity with fellow citizens in other parts of the country, sometimes showing contempt.
And he includes himself in this critique, doesn't he? His own journey from Sheffield.
He does. He calls his own peeling off a shameful action and describes his later life and work, including this book, as a kind of atonement.
That adds a real personal dimension to the argument.
It really does. And he talks about how hard it is to build narratives that foster patriotism, which he sees as positive, based on cooperation and mutual care without tipping over into nationalism, which is more zero-sum, us versus them.
And that anecdote about the Treasury, suggesting closing further education colleges.
Astonishing, isn't it? The idea that nobody would notice. If you closed institutions serving half the population, the non-university half. For Collier, it's a prime example of how detached policymakers in the metropolis can become.
It really underscores his point about the divides and the lack of understanding. Yeah.
Absolutely. You can see how he weaves it all together, the economics, the ethics, the personal stories, the politics.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, the core message from Collier seems to be this. Capitalism needs fixing. It's creating these deep anxieties and divisions because it's lost its ethical compass, specifically that idea of reciprocal obligation.
Yeah, his solution isn't to ditch capitalism, but to manage it ethically, to rebuild a sense of community, mutual responsibility in our companies, our families, our state. That's how we ensure everyone has a chance at a dignified life.
And he offers these pragmatic, sometimes quite radical steps to try and get us there, pushing back against what he sees as the dead ends of recent ideologies on both left and right.
It's definitely a challenging perspective.
Yeah.
It asks a lot of questions about our values, not just our economic policies.
It really does. A blend of economic analysis, personal reflection, and a strong ethical call to action. It's certainly given us a lot to think about.
Absolutely. Makes you reconsider the foundations of how our society works, or maybe how it should work.
Right. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to take away from all this. Given Collier's arguments about reciprocity, dignity, and shared identity, how do you see those playing out or not playing out in your own life? In your workplace, maybe, or your community? And following on from that, what responsibility do you think we all have as individuals, within companies, and through the state in trying to build that more ethical form of capitalism he's calling for?